I had no idea what I was walking into when I moved into this neighborhood. Most people think moving into a new home means dealing with the usual growing pains, figuring out where the grocery store is, finding the right coffee shop, and just settling into a new rhythm. But what I didn't expect was a self-proclaimed neighborhood enforcer who thought she could rule the block. That's right, Karen. The type of person who's convinced she's in charge of everything and everyone. The HOA Karen. It didn't take long for her to start making her presence known, and trust me, it wasn't in a good way. It all started innocently enough. At first, it was just little things. Some minor complaints about my lawn not being trimmed to her liking. A few passive-aggressive notes slipped under my door, hinting that my yard wasn't up to community standards. Okay, fine. I'll admit it wasn't perfect, but I didn't think it was that big of a deal. And I thought, maybe I was overreacting, maybe I was just new here and didn't fully understand how things worked. So, I brushed it off. But then the complaints kept coming. Every time I turned around, there was something else I was apparently doing wrong. My trash bins weren't positioned just right, and the fact that I didn't pull them in exactly 5 minutes after pickup was somehow grounds for a notice. It was starting to feel like I was in the middle of a sitcom about a micromanaging neighbor who had too much time on her hands. I couldn't understand why she was so obsessed with my every move. I thought maybe she was just lonely. Maybe she just liked to complain for the sake of it. So I tried to play along, humoring her ridiculous requests. I trimmed the lawn, adjusted the trash bins, dimmed the porch light. Whatever she wanted, I did it. I tried to keep the peace, but no matter how hard I tried, it wasn't enough for Karen. There was always something new, always another complaint. It was getting old fast, but I told myself it's not worth the drama. Little did I know that was just the beginning. And then it escalated. It wasn't just the lawn anymore. It wasn't about the trash or the porch light. This time Karen came after something much bigger. One morning, I opened my mailbox and found an official-looking envelope from the HOA. My first thought was that it was just another fine for some ridiculous thing I'd missed. Honestly, I didn't even think twice as I ripped it open. But the second I read it, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It wasn't just a fine. It wasn't even another petty complaint. No, this time, Karen had taken things to a whole new level. She was trying to evict me from my own home. The letter was absurd. The HOA had somehow deemed me unfit to live in the neighborhood. It was as though Karen had single-handedly decided that I didn't belong here, and that I should just pack up and leave. She claimed that I was in violation of the community standards, whatever those were, and that because of my ongoing infractions, which were really just her petty complaints, they were initiating the eviction process. The letter even stated that I had 30 days to vacate the property or face legal action. I stood there staring at the letter, my mind spinning. How could they even do this? I owned my house. There was no way the HOA could evict me from something I legally owned. Was this some kind of joke? I could hardly wrap my head around it. I reread the letter, hoping I was missing something. Maybe there was a misunderstanding? Number. The letter was crystal clear, and then I saw it, the final line that made my stomach drop. It said, "Failure to comply may result in foreclosure proceedings." Foreclosure? I could feel my blood pressure rising as the full weight of what was happening sank in. This wasn't just an eviction notice. This was an attempt to financially pressure me out of my home. Karen, in her role as HOA queen, was using the HOA's authority to try to push me into a corner. The worst part? She thought it would work. But here's where things get interesting. What Karen didn't know, what no one knew, was that I wasn't just some random homeowner. I was Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary for President Trump. And while that might not sound like it has anything to do with HOA drama, trust me, it gave me a whole new perspective on handling people who think they can push others around. In the world of politics, I'm used to handling high-pressure situations and people who think they can control others. So when Karen thought she could bully me out of my own home, I realized that it was time to turn the tables. She didn't know who she was messing with. I took a deep breath and let out a short laugh. Seriously? The HOA thought they could get away with this? The more I thought about it, the more absurd it seemed. And then it hit me. I wasn't just the homeowner, I was also the landlord. And Karen, in all her self-righteousness, didn't realize that the property she was renting was one of mine. She had no idea that while she was trying to evict me from my own home, I could turn the tables and evict her from the house she was renting from me. Oh, the irony. The same person who was trying to throw me out of my home was, in fact, living in one of my properties, paying me rent. I couldn't help but chuckle at how the tables had turned. Karen had no idea what was coming. As I sat there thinking about it, I pulled up my property management files and found her lease agreement. I skimmed through it, my eyes scanning for any loopholes or clauses I might have forgotten. Nope. Everything was airtight. Karen wasn't just some overzealous HOA president, she was my tenant. And she was in violation of multiple clauses in her lease. Harassing neighbors? Check. Unauthorized alterations to the property? Check. Trying to interfere with my rights as the owner? Big check. Karen had no idea that the eviction notice she'd sent me could easily be sent right back to her. She had no idea that her little HOA games were about to be turned against her in the most satisfying way possible. It was time to pay her a visit. I couldn't let this absurd eviction notice just sit there. No way. The whole thing was so ridiculous I had to laugh. I mean, how could Karen even think she had the authority to kick me out of a home I legally owned? I wasn't some renter at her mercy. I was the one with the power. But I had to be smart about how I handled this. As someone who has navigated the world of press briefings and political battles as the White House press secretary, I knew that sometimes you had to let people make their move before you hit them with the reality check. Karen had no idea who she was up against. So I sat down at my desk, staring at that eviction notice like it was a bad joke. But this wasn't just some petty HOA drama. This was something far more personal for me. I had worked hard to build my life, and no one was going to take that from me. Certainly not someone who spent her time policing everyone's lawns and trash bins. I opened up my property management files, and sure enough, there it was. The lease agreement that had Karen's name on it. She was my tenant, and she had no idea that her little power play had just landed her in hot water. I leaned back in my chair and let out a sigh. As much as I wanted to just send her a quick email, I knew this moment deserved more. After all, Karen wasn't just messing with a regular homeowner. She was messing with someone who could and would fight back. I didn't have to prove anything to her, but the satisfaction of turning the tables on her would be sweet. I was going to enjoy this. I decided to go to her house in person. I wasn't going to let her hide behind her HOA authority anymore. She needed to face the truth head on. As I walked toward her house, I couldn't help but think about how smug she had always been whenever she walked around the neighborhood. She thought she could bully anyone who didn't fit her idea of what was acceptable. Well, it was time to shatter that little illusion of hers. I could already see her standing in front of her house, probably doing her usual thing, monitoring someone's garden or critiquing their porch light, or whatever else she found to complain about. When she saw me walking down the street, I could already tell by her expression that she knew something was up. "Got the notice, huh?" she said, folding her arms in that signature, smug Karen way. "It's nothing personal," she continued, acting like this was just some routine business transaction. "But the HOA has made its decision. You don't fit the community standards, and we can't have that." I couldn't help but roll my eyes. She seriously thought she had the power to control people's lives like this. I reached into my bag and pulled out the lease termination papers. I could see the confusion flicker across her face when she saw what I was holding. I didn't wait for her to say anything else. "Actually, Karen," I said, leaning in just a little closer, "I've got a response." I handed her the papers slowly, watching her eyes move over the words. She didn't understand what she was reading at first. She probably thought it was another HOA warning. But then it hit her. The color drained from her face as her eyes locked on the most important part of the document, the terms of her lease. She wasn't just my neighbor, she was my tenant, and she was in violation of multiple clauses in her contract. She took a step back, stumbling over her words. What is this?" she stammered, clearly trying to process what was happening. I leaned forward and gave her a cool smile. "This is your eviction notice, Karen. The house you've been living in, it's mine, and you've been breaking the rules. So now I'm terminating your lease." Her face twisted in shock, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't quite believe what was happening. I could see her struggling to find an argument, a way to wriggle out of this, but there was no escape. The reality of it hit her like a ton of bricks. She thought she was in control. She thought she could kick me out, but I was the one with the power. I wasn't some new homeowner trying to avoid HOA drama. I was someone who understood the rules, and when you mess with someone who knows the law, you end up getting burned. At first, Karen didn't know how to respond. She just stood there, frozen, clutching the papers in her hands like she was waiting for them to magically change. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You don't have the authority." I could feel the tension in the air as I met her eyes. "Oh, I do," I said calmly. "See, Karen, You sent me an eviction notice for a property I own. But you failed to realize that you've been living in a property I have the legal right to evict you from. Funny how that works, huh? I could tell her mind was racing, trying to find some way out of this, but there was no loophole. No technicality. She had no way to avoid the inevitable. At that moment, I knew this was just the beginning. Karen was in denial, but that was her problem, not mine. I had all the legal backing, all the right to evict her, and I wasn't about to back down. She could try to fight this, but it wasn't going to make a difference. She wasn't going to win. I smiled and turned to walk away, knowing the drama was far from over. As I left, I couldn't help but think about how sweet it would be to see her face when she realized she had no power anymore. She'd tried to make my life miserable, but now the tables had turned, and I was ready for whatever move she tried to make next. Karen's reaction was everything I'd expected and more. She tried to hold it together at first, but the shock was evident on her face. There was no denying it now. She had been running the neighborhood like a dictator, thinking she could control everyone's lives, and in one moment I completely shattered that illusion. She was standing there holding the termination of lease papers, staring at them like she was waiting for them to magically turn into something else. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered how she had been treating me for months and how she thought she could get away with her petty HOA games. No sympathy here. Karen blinked rapidly, trying to process what was happening. You can't do this," she said, her voice shaking. Her expression was a mix of disbelief and anger, and I could practically see her trying to find some way out of this. But the truth was, there was no escape. She had crossed a line, and now the tables had completely turned. The power dynamic that she had so carefully constructed, where she called the shots in the neighborhood, was gone in an instant. I stood there, watching her, letting the silence hang in the air. For someone who was so used to being in control, she was struggling to come to terms with her new reality. She wasn't in charge anymore. I was the one holding all the cards. "Karen," I said, my voice calm but firm, "you've been living in my property this whole time, and you've broken the rules. I've got every right to terminate your lease, and I've done just that. You don't get to hide behind the HOA anymore." Her face paled, and I saw her swallow hard as she tried to regain some semblance of her former confidence. This is a joke, right?" she stammered, looking at the papers like they might disappear if she just willed it. "You can't just evict me like this." I shook my head, barely able to hide a smile. "No, Karen, this is no joke. You've been harassing neighbors, altering my property without permission, and trying to push me out of my own home. You've violated the terms of your lease in several ways, and now you're going to pay the price for it." There was no doubt in my mind that Karen had thought she could pull this off with minimal consequences. After all, she'd been running roughshod over people for so long, never imagining someone would stand up to her. But that's exactly what had happened, and now she had nowhere to turn. The anger in her eyes was starting to build, but I didn't flinch. "You don't have the authority to do this," she spat, as if repeating it enough would somehow make it true. "You think you can just walk in here and take everything from me? You can't." I stood my ground, my posture firm, my resolve unwavering. "Actually, I can, because it's my property. And as much as you want to think you can control everything, you can't. Not when it comes to me." I was enjoying every second of this. The woman who thought she was invincible, who had tried to push me out of my own home, was now face to face with the reality that she was the one who was about to lose everything. It was a beautiful reversal of fortunes. But Karen wasn't giving up that easily. She had her pride to protect, even if that meant digging herself further into a hole. "You won't get away with this," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but the venom in it was palpable. "The HOA will make sure you regret this. They'll back me up. They'll stop you." She was clearly clutching at straws now, hoping that the HOA, the same organization she had so casually used to bully people, would come to her rescue. I could see it in her eyes. She couldn't believe that things were falling apart so quickly. I shook my head. "You've really underestimated me, haven't you, Karen? The HOA doesn't have the power to interfere with legal landlord-tenant matters. The only thing they can do is continue to send you more warnings. But at the end of the day, it's my name on that lease, not theirs, and I've already made my decision." The more I spoke, the more her face twisted in frustration. She could see it in my eyes. I wasn't backing down. She was powerless in this situation, and she knew it. As I turned to leave, I couldn't resist adding one last parting shot. You'll be out of my property soon, Karen, and when that day comes, you'll know exactly what it feels like to be on the receiving end of a little power play. Good luck with that." The look on her face was priceless. She stood there, dumbfounded, as if the ground had just been ripped out from under her. For someone who had spent so much of her time trying to control everyone around her, this was a bitter pill to swallow. But I wasn't done with her yet. I still had to deal with the HOA, and I had no intention of letting them off the hook, just because Karen had failed to get her way. The very next morning, as expected, I received an email from the HOA. The subject line was bold and accusatory. "Illegal eviction notice, violation of HOA bylaws." I opened the email, already knowing exactly what I was about to read. The HOA, in their never-ending quest to protect Karen's delicate ego, was claiming that I had broken some rule by attempting to evict her. They threatened to fine me, to take legal action, to do whatever they could to protect Karen from the consequences of her own actions. As I read through their email, I couldn't help but laugh. Did they really think they could scare me into backing down? They didn't have a leg to stand on. HOA rules had no jurisdiction over my rights as a landlord. I wasn't trying to remove a resident from my property because I didn't like them. I was evicting a tenant who had violated the terms of her lease. Plain and simple. So I composed a response that was professional but left no room for misunderstanding. I made it clear that the HOA had no power to interfere with a legal landlord-tenant dispute. I reminded them that Karen was not just a resident of the neighborhood. She was my tenant, and her behavior had crossed a line. The HOA's involvement wasn't just unnecessary, it was borderline harassment. The response I sent wasn't just about defending myself. It was about sending a message. I wasn't going to let Karen or the HOA think they could get away with this. I wasn't the type of person who let others walk all over me, and now they were going to learn that. The HOA could threaten all they wanted, but at the end of the day, I was the one with the legal right to make decisions about my property. I hit send and leaned back in my chair, feeling a sense of satisfaction. Karen had thought she could use the HOA to do her dirty work. She had underestimated me at every turn. And now, as I watched her world begin to crumble, I couldn't help but think. The best part was, it was just getting started. The days following my response to the HOA felt like a waiting game. Karen, I knew, was doing everything in her power to avoid facing reality. She was scrambling for an angle, looking for any way to delay the inevitable. The HOA, I assumed, was also trying to figure out what to do next, but in their desperation to protect her, they were only digging themselves deeper. Meanwhile, I had my legal ducks in a row, everything ready for the next step. The eviction was happening, and it was only a matter of time before Karen had to face the consequences of her actions. But I didn't expect what happened next. The very next morning, I received a call from my lawyer. It was a quick update about the legal proceedings, just confirming that everything was moving forward as planned. Then, he mentioned something odd. Apparently, Karen had filed a bogus harassment complaint against me. At first, I laughed. It was so typical of her to try to shift the focus away from her own mistakes and cast herself as the victim. The funny thing was, I knew exactly how to handle this. I wasn't some rookie homeowner just trying to avoid a nuisance. I had experience navigating high-stakes situations, especially after spending so much time as press secretary for President Trump. This wasn't the first time I had to deal with people trying to use legal tactics to delay or deflect, and Karen's little complaint wouldn't stand a chance. The next few days passed by with little more than back-and-forth emails from the HOA, all of which I ignored. I had already made it clear to them that their interference wouldn't change a thing. But I knew Karen wouldn't back down so easily. She was the kind of person who didn't know when to quit, and this eviction was no different. Sure enough, just as I was preparing to make the next move, I got a call from my lawyer again, this time with some more surprising news. Karen had filed yet another complaint, this time with the police. She was claiming I was harassing her, trying to force her out of the property illegally, and using intimidation tactics to make her leave. I couldn't believe it. Did she honestly think the police would side with her? Did she really believe that the law would protect her when it was clear she was the one breaking the rules? I knew Karen was going to try everything in her power to avoid leaving. She'd probably start making up lies about me or filing fake complaints, hoping something would stick. But it wasn't going to work. This was no longer about petty HOA drama or neighborhood politics. It was about legal rights. The police weren't going to help her. They would see through her tactics, just like I had. As much as she tried to shift the narrative, the facts were on my side. She was still violating her lease agreement, and the eviction was moving forward. So I wasn't shocked when the police showed up at my door. I had already prepared for this, knowing that Karen would drag anyone she could into the mess. When the officers arrived, they told me they needed to speak with me about the complaint Karen had filed. Honestly, I wasn't even bothered. I knew this was just a formality, something she thought would intimidate me into backing down. I had dealt with far worse than this in my career. "Let me guess," I said with a smile. "Karen called you, right?" They exchanged a look, and I could tell they knew exactly who they were dealing with. "Yeah," one of the officers said. "She claims you're attempting an unlawful eviction and that you're using intimidation tactics. We just need to ask a few questions." I stepped aside to let them in. "Come on in," I said, gesturing to my office. "I have plenty to show you." I wasn't worried. I had all the documentation, the lease agreement, the termination notice, the email responses from the HOA, and more. As soon as I started showing them everything, it was clear there was nothing unlawful happening here. I showed them Karen's lease, where she had violated multiple clauses. I showed them her past complaints, which I had meticulously documented. I showed them the responses from the HOA, and I made it clear that I had every right to evict her. The officers flipped through everything carefully, and after a few minutes of looking through the papers, one of them sighed and looked at his partner. "This is completely legal," he said. "She's not being evicted unlawfully. There's nothing to this." The other officer nodded in agreement. "We're sorry for the inconvenience," he said, "but it's clear this is a civil matter. She doesn't have a case." I couldn't help but smile. It was over. Karen's little scheme had failed. The officers looked at me, and one of them gave me an apologetic glance. "This happens more often than you think," he said. "Some people don't understand that HOA rules don't override property ownership. You're in the right here." As they left, one of the officers knocked on Karen's door. I didn't stick around to hear the conversation, but I'm pretty sure it was the moment when Karen realized that she had no more tricks up her sleeve. That night, I sat back and enjoyed the peace of knowing that Karen's reign was finally coming to an end. She had no more moves, and neither did the HOA. Everything was in motion now, and nothing would stop it. The eviction was happening, and Karen was about to learn what happens when you try to mess with someone who knows how to play the game. When eviction day arrived, I wasn't even surprised that Karen still hadn't packed. For the past month, she had tried to do everything she could to delay the process, filing complaints, trying to turn people against me, making more and more ridiculous claims. She thought she could stall, but it was all over now. The sheriff's department arrived on time, and I stood across the street, arms crossed, watching as Karen opened her door. The moment she saw the officers, her face shifted from annoyance to full-blown panic. She had spent the past few weeks fighting, and now she was about to lose everything. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, his voice firm but calm, "we're here to execute a court-ordered eviction. You have 15 minutes to vacate the premises. Any remaining belongings will be removed by a locksmith and a cleanup crew." Karen's eyes widened, and I could see her mouth working, trying to protest. "This is my home! You can't just—" The officer didn't flinch. "No, ma'am, this is his home," he said, pointing directly at me. "You've had 30 days to leave. You are now trespassing on private property. If you don't comply, we'll have no choice but to place you under arrest." I watched as the reality of the situation sank in. Karen was no longer in charge. She was no longer the one holding the power. She was now the one being removed, forcibly, from the home she had tried to control for so long. She looked at me, desperation creeping into her voice. "You don't have to do this," she pleaded. "We can work something out. I'll drop the complaints." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, now you want to negotiate? After everything you've done to me? After trying to have me kicked out of my own home, filing bogus complaints, making life miserable for everyone around you?" Her face turned red with humiliation, but I wasn't about to let her off the hook now. "No, Karen," I said. "You made your bed. Now lie in it." For a moment, it looked like she might actually comply, but then I heard a crash coming from inside the house. "Ma'am," one of the officers shouted as they moved toward the door, "step away from the property." Karen had snapped. She was knocking things over, throwing furniture around like a child throwing a tantrum. She was so out of control that the officers had to intervene just to keep her from breaking anything major. I stood there, shaking my head, watching it all unfold. The officers asked me if I wanted to press charges for property damage, but I just waved them off. "No," I said. "I just want her out." Finally, 15 minutes later, Karen emerged from the house, dragging a suitcase behind her. Her face was red, her eyes filled with rage and humiliation. She glared at me, but there was nothing left to say. She knew she had lost. She knew it was over. She climbed into her car, slammed the door, and sped off, leaving behind the wreckage of her little power trip. The officers changed the locks on the house, and I signed the final paperwork. It was done. Karen was gone, and the neighborhood was finally free from her oppressive grip. The next day, as I sat in my living room, I got an email from the HOA. It was about a new vacancy on their board. They wanted me to apply. I laughed out loud. Karen's house was empty. The neighborhood was calm again. And now they wanted me to take her place on the HOA board? Not a chance. I closed the email with a smirk, knowing that while Karen was long gone, I'd always have the satisfaction of knowing I outsmarted her at every turn.